Okay, so a neutral spine refers to the three natural curves present in a healthy spine. You should see a lordotic curve in the lumbar region and the cervical region, or your low back and neck. You could also think of this as a slight arch or extension. And you should see a kyphotic curve in the thoracic region, or your mid-back. This is a slight rounding or flexion. Now, the benefits of a neutral spine are improved placement, posture, alignment, as well as shock absorption and muscle recruitment. When a joint lies in its neutral position, muscles lie in their proper length. Therefore, they are able to generate more force with less effort. Or you could think of this as your ability to meet effort with more ease. Now, when we talk about a neutral spine, we really need to bring the pelvis into the equation. So at Move Method, we teach how to find neutral placement of the pelvis along with neutral placement of the spine. Now, there are times when placement of the pelvis will not affect the placement of the spine, but more often than not, it will. So we teach them hand in hand. A neutral pelvis simply refers to your ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine, also known as your hip bones, and your PSIS, posterior superior iliac spine, lying in the same plane, or as close to the same plane as possible. Later on, we'll discuss this in a little more depth, and you'll see that at times the PSIS might be a little bit higher than the ASIS, and the pelvis is still neutral. This can be common in women. Now, another reference point you could use is you could place the heels of your hands on your ASIS and point your fingers down to your pubic symphysis and look at how those bony landmarks line up. Are they level with one another? If they are, pelvis is most likely in neutral. Now, we'll go over this in some later videos and work on finding neutral lying down, so in a reclined position, seated, as well as standing. Now, as I mentioned with the spine, there are some benefits to being in neutral. Same thing applies to the pelvis. Benefits of the pelvis being in neutral are improved posture, improved alignment, improved placement, as well as muscle recruitment. Again, when muscles lie in their proper length, they are able to generate more force with less effort. You become more efficient, and that should be the goal, to be more efficient as a dancer. You want efficiency and ease of movement. So simply restoring neutral in people that have deviated from that in the spine and the pelvis can really help with improved movement patterns and muscle recruitment and ease and efficiency. So let's talk about a few deviations that can happen in the pelvis because they're pretty common in the dance world. And deviations likely happen because one muscular group has shortened while another has lengthened. So it is not uncommon in the dance world to see what's called an anterior pelvic tilt. We'll go through anterior pelvic tilt and what it looks like in a little while, but I just want to talk about what happens when we move to this position. So the hip flexors will shorten and the hip extensors tend to lengthen. The low back tends to shorten and the abdominals tend to lengthen. Now, short muscles can become tight and we lose mobility, while lengthened muscles can become weak and they lose contractibility. So once we move into a postural deviation, we lose range of motion and efficiency. So we want to restore neutral to improve range of motion and efficiency. Now, sometimes people wonder, well, what came first? The tightening of the hip flexors or the weakening of the hamstrings? I don't think that that's the biggest concern. I think what we want to do is address that it has happened and then work on restoring the pelvis to neutral. So now when the pelvis moves anteriorly, we generally see a change in the lumbar spine. The lordotic curve increases. Now this creates some tightening in the low back and can be a little bit painful. So there's more compression going on, the low back's feeling tight, we lose some movement and mobility. So what do? Well, we at Move Method focus on lengthening the muscles that have shortened. Once we lengthen the muscles that have shortened and restore a neutral pelvis and a neutral spine, then we can really start to work on conditioning. If you were to start with conditioning prior to stretching, it's like you're fighting just a little bit bigger battle than you need to fight because the muscles that have shortened are more powerful, they're stronger, so they're going to be wanting to pull the pelvis anteriorly while you're wanting to strengthen the hamstrings. The hamstrings are lacking strength, so they don't contract as powerfully. So rather than fighting this battle, just restore the muscles to their proper length so that you can strengthen and condition in a neutral placement. Now, another common deviation in the dance world would be a posterior tilt. So that's when the ASIS move posterior to the symphysis pubis. Now, this involves a shortening of the glutes and the hamstrings and a lengthening of the hip flexors. Now, you will often see a decrease in the lordotic curve of the lumbar spine, so it's kind of a flattening of the back. That can transfer all the way up the back. Now, any postural deviation can actually transfer all the way up the back. It's important to note that not everyone won't be the same. So one postural deviation of the pelvis is not going to have the same effect on that person's spine as the same postural deviation of the pelvis could have on the next person's spine. We're all individual. You can't put everybody into a box and say, because your pelvis moved posteriorly, this is going to happen to your spine. It's not the case. There's a little more gray, so you have to be open to a few more possibilities when we're addressing posture and what happened, why it happened, how do we fix it. So when we move into a posterior tilt, we get a tightening in the back of the legs. So glutes, the glute maximus tends to tighten as well as the hamstring muscles. And then we'll see a lengthening in the hip flexors. Now, when the hip flexors come to a lengthened position, it can be kind of confusing for them because as a dancer, they need to be able to work a lot. You're doing a lot of hip flexion. Your legs coming forward into a battement, your legs coming forward into a grand jeté, passe, whether it's parallel or turned out, hip flexors are working. When they are placed in an elongated state, and that becomes their new norm, their contractibility or their ability to fire efficiently decreases. So they have to now work harder, and they don't really like it. And so pain can start to happen, inflammation can start to happen, overuse can start to happen. So it's really important for the hip flexors to be in their ideal position to be performing all the hip flexion required of a dancer. Now, no dancer wants to have tight hamstrings and hip extensors, but if we're pulling the pelvis under and that becomes your new neutral, those muscles are going to tighten to hold the pelvis in that place. Now, one reason this tends to happen is when dancers are overusing their glutes to achieve turnout. So your glute maximus should not be the muscle that's engaging to create turnout. Your glute maximus is for hip extension, but what happens is a lot of dancers will tilt their pelvis forward a bit to extend the hip to engage the glute because it can help a dancer turn out. But that is not the muscle we should be relying on for turnout. You have 6 muscles that are designed for external hip rotation. It's important that you are using the muscles designed to do the work they're supposed to do, not a muscle that wasn't. Anytime you start relying on a muscle that wasn't really designed to do that movement, you're going to see lengthening in another muscular group, overworking. So everything's trying to overcompensate. I think of it as you're confusing your muscles. They don't know what action they're supposed to be doing when you place a joint in a position that it wasn't really meant to be in. So if you're overworking your glutes to encourage your turnout, you're likely elongating your hip flexors and they'll probably start overworking. Your inner hip can start overworking, and when these muscles start to overwork, they become strong, they become stiff, they become kind of dysfunctional. And so when you go to recruit them, they don't work as well. When you go to stretch them, they don't want to release. So how do we correct this? Well, we want to definitely stop using the glutes to find turnout. Glutes and abdominals are used to maintain us upright, so there is a slight activation in your glutes, but they are not your primary turnout muscles, so try not to rely on them for that. Rather, rely on your deep 6 external hip rotators for turnout. Rely on your abdominals and glutes to stabilize your posture and hold you upright. So is there a gentle contraction or an activation of your glutes? Yes, but it's not this clenching feeling that sends your hips forward and tightens the back of your legs. So one thing you can do is to avoid using the glutes for turnout. Then really focus on stretching your hamstrings. Then really focus on strengthening your hip flexors. But again, I recommend stretch first, so stretch the muscles that are tightened, restore the pelvis to neutral, restore the natural curves of the spine, then work on strengthening muscles that may have become weakened due to a postural deviation. Another postural deviation we see commonly in the dance world, and that can affect a dancer quite a bit, particularly with upper body mobility and balance, is a tilt in the pelvis. So when one hip lifts higher than the other, it might be to the right, it might be to the left. When this happens, we see a tightening or shortening in the side body on one side. So if the left hip were to elevate, you're going to experience a tightening in the left side body. So your obliques, your QL, and a QL can be really obnoxious when it gets tight. It can cause back pain and discomfort and really limit mobility, particularly in side bending, as well as some muscles that attach to the scapula and can affect scapular and shoulder mobility. So when we become tight in our side body, we decrease the amount of upper body mobility we have, but also scapular and shoulder mobility, all of which are very, very important for a dancer to have. Now on that same side that tightens, you will find that the outer hip weakens. Your outer hip muscles are designed to stabilize the pelvis when you transfer weight. So when one foot lifts off, the abductors, the muscles on the outer part of the hip, should engage right then, stabilize the pelvis. If they are elongated and weak, they will not contract as quickly. Therefore, balance is not going to happen as efficiently. Dancers need to be very efficient in balancing. So dance is one big balancing act. You're transferring weight constantly from your right foot to from your left foot, forward and back. So we really want our abductors responsive. The other issue is that on the opposite side, we're going to see a lengthening or weakening in one side of the torso. So now we're not going to be as efficient in movement through the upper body or stability, so it can affect your stability as well. And then the outer hip tightens. We don't want tightness in any part of the hips as a dancer. So you need to have equal mobility for range of motion, but also to keep the hips balanced and avoid overuse injuries, avoid pain, avoid injury. So as these muscles tighten, it's very important to incorporate stretches that target the lateral hip and thigh or your abductors. And then we also want to be targeting the side body. So through stretching, we can bring the pelvis back to a neutral position and then work on restoring strength.